Ashley, what is our first official email today?
First one up is Patreon supporter Luca A. As pretty much everyone and their mother knows, Spielberg has had some interesting views on movies from major streaming services. I just want to know your thoughts and stance on this, and to also ask, don't a fair amount of the Academy see these movies on a TV screen with their screener anyway?
All right, Steven Spielberg, who, by the way, is the governor of the directors branch of the Academy. So he is a bigwig at the Academy, which is appropriate. He is the greatest filmmaker of all time. In my opinion, at least, any rate. So it's been known for a while that he's had some issues with differentiating Netflix movies or any kind of streaming movies versus what he considers to be like real movies, theatrical movies. Now, this came up to a little bit of a head again just recently, as a couple of days ago, Steven Spielberg, they made it known that he is going to be going to the next meeting of the Academy of Motion Arts and Sciences, and he's going to be proposing changes to the eligibility rules. Because right now, for a movie to be eligible for an Academy Award nomination, to be eligible, there's lots of little details, but the main underlying rule is this. Your movie's got to play in a theater in Los Angeles and New York for at least 1 week where paying customers can go see it. So what has happened traditionally is a lot of films have, including Netflix films, they kind of use that loophole. They rent out a theater in Los Angeles for a couple of days and show their movie there. And then there, we met the eligibility requirement. Steven Spielberg is suggesting that there is a difference between made-for-TV movies and made-for-theatrical release movies. And he wants to create changes in the Academy. And I don't think that he's going to get the support of the Academy to do this, but he's going to be seeking to make changes so that you actually have to follow the rules that other studio films have to follow. Now, I believe that there are a couple of reasons why I think Steven Spielberg is missing the mark, and a couple of ways in ways that I think he's making at least a good point. In the ways that I think Spielberg is missing the mark here is this, and I've said this forever. A movie is a movie regardless of what screen you throw it up on. And I would contend that there are probably a number of Netflix movies that when they were shooting the movie, the filmmakers never knew it was going to be a Netflix movie. I would propose to you that there are a number of films out there and directors who started making a movie assuming it was going to be a theatrical release film. The Cloverfield movie that went straight to Netflix is a good example of that. That was, when they were making that movie, it was always their intention that it was going to be theatrically released, blah, blah, blah. It ended up on Netflix. Okay, so a movie is a movie regardless of what, which screen, whether it's a 40-foot screen or a 40-inch screen that it was being developed to. And I think that's something that Steven Spielberg is missing here. Where I think Steven Spielberg makes a couple of valid points that I think everybody should at least consider is this. Point number one. Steven Spielberg's argument is that, look, there have always been movies made for television, and they are recognized and honored at the Emmys. That's the history of it. There's always been a place for movies that are made for television screens, and those movies are recognized and honored at the Emmys. Steven Spielberg's point is simply this. Why does Netflix get an exemption from that when NBC makes a movie for NBC, or when whatever else, any other network traditionally has made a movie for broadcast? Their movies are honored at the Emmys. Why does Netflix get special consideration and get treated differently than all the others? They have movies that are made for television. Therefore, Steven Spielberg argues, they should be honored at the Emmys. That's a valid point that you at least have to consider. You have to at least consider that because, why does Netflix get to be considered for one thing and not the other when other bodies making these movies for broadcast don't? So I think that's something to consider. The other point that Steven Spielberg makes that I believe is at least a valid point that we should consider is the fact that Netflix gets the best of both worlds in the fact that they don't have to follow the rules that other studios do. When studios make their motion pictures that are destined for the theaters, they have to follow a certain set of rules, not the least of which is they have to have a roughly 3-month window between when their movie debuts in a theater and when it can then become available for home video, when it can be made available on either Blu-ray or streaming or whatever, right? Studios have these rules that they've got to follow. So, hey, we put it in a theater, and then we have to wait 3 months, and then it can be available for home video. Netflix is trying to have the best of both worlds. They want to be able to put it in theater. They want to be able to be Oscar eligible, but they don't want to have to follow the rules that everybody else does. This is the argument that Steven Spielberg makes. So what Netflix has done is use the loophole to say, okay, we put it in a theater for 5 minutes, and then 5 minutes after we pulled out of theater, we put it up on Netflix. There, we met the criteria. Now, I'm going to say right up front here, Rob, I do not agree in general with Spielberg. I think that you do have to find a way, and maybe there's some clarification that needs to happen here in the rules, but I think there has to be room at the Oscars for films that do not ultimately end up on the big screen in a theater. Because what happens with a lot of indie films? If an indie film can't pick up a distributor, does that mean it shouldn't be Oscar eligible and stuff like that? But at the same time, while I agree with most people that Steven Spielberg might be incorrect in this, and I agree with everybody on that, I also don't see anybody tackling those questions. That those, what I believe are valid points that Spielberg is at least bringing up and saying, you know what? Spielberg's at least making a point. We may not agree with him, but we do have to address these issues. Why does Netflix get to go in the Oscars when everybody else who makes movies for broadcast or for the television screen goes to the Emmys? Why does Netflix get to go to the Oscars and not have to follow any of the rules that everybody else does when all the other studios have to follow those rules? And I think the answer is not just to say that Netflix movies shouldn't be eligible for the Oscars. I think rather the issue here and what Steven Spielberg should be focusing on is, hey guys, look, everybody wants Netflix movies eligible for the Oscars. So why don't we sit down as the Academy, figure out what we want, and then let's sit down with Netflix and say, okay, let's do this, but we have two concerns. How do we address this thing about, Emmys versus Oscars? How do we address this thing about the fact that you don't have to follow the rules that everybody else does? Instead of just saying no Netflix films at the Oscars, which is what Steven Spielberg seems to be doing, address the real issues. And these seems to be the issues he's having. Robert, you're a member of the Academy. Steven Spielberg comes in and lays out this argument. What do you see as the points working against Spielberg's argument? What do you see as maybe a couple of the valid points he may be raising? And how do you address it?
Well, I think it's tough, but ultimately I think what Steven Spielberg is trying to do is preserve the movie-going experience, the communal theatrical movie-going experience. And for that, I laud him. I mean, I totally appreciate that. But we live in a very changing the landscape, the fabric of movie-going and content consumption. We're in the midst of a evolutionary sea change that's been going on now for over a decade. And if you allow a Netflix movie, why shouldn't you allow an HBO movie? HBO is part of the Emmys. Why is HBO any different than Netflix? I mean, originally the Emmys were created to honor broadcast commercial television, which had commercials, in between. Like a movie wouldn't play on TV without commercials. So the entire viewing experience was sort of different. And then when cable players like HBO and Showtime came in and started making Emmy-worthy programming, then they were allowed into the Emmys, and HBO shows and network shows simply can't compete against one another because philosophically, HBO programming, they don't have to have commercials and they're unfettered by any constraints of content. HBO can put whatever they want in their movies. So they have an advantage at the Emmys. I mean, I think an unfair advantage to compete at the Emmys. And now we're seeing Netflix come in and challenge. I mean, Netflix and Amazon Studios. I mean, Manchester by the Sea was an Oscar contender, and that was an Amazon Studios movie. And Amazon releases movies theatrically. I think that the simple solution is if Netflix wants to compete, they themselves just have to play by the existing theatrical rules that currently are in place. And that means their movies have to go out, be in theaters, or play for 3 months before going direct to Netflix. That's to me the simplest solution. Because otherwise, the whole idea is to preserve the speciality of the experience of going to a movie theater, to have that communal experience. And I'm with Spielberg in that sense, but things are changing. And as home theaters become bigger but I appreciate where Spielberg's heart is, and I think it's an easy solution. Just force Netflix to play by the Academy rules, period.
and then leave it up to Netflix to say, well, we don't want to play by those rules, so we'll live on the Emmys, or yeah, okay, let's play by the rules. Or I agree with you, Robert. See, I just think that the issue isn't let's just take Netflix out of the Oscar consideration. Let's identify what the problematic areas are and address the problematic areas instead of just saying let's throw the baby out with the proverbial bathwater, you know?
Yeah, I just think leave it up to them. You just say to Netflix, look, these are our rules. They exist. We're not going to change our rules for you. And these rules are very simple. There's no reason why a movie that can't go direct to Netflix. It's Netflix wants to philosophically change the Academy rules to suit them. When what they should just be doing is, if you want to play in the Oscars, if you want to be an Oscar contender, here's the rules, follow them. Period.
Right. And that's, I think, and because rules like the 3-month windows and all stuff like that, those aren't existing rules within the Academy itself right now. I think that's one of the things that maybe Spielberg is trying to propose. Let's adjust the rules. Let's say, okay, look, all these other studios have to do this. So now we're going to say to be an Oscar eligible, you have to be in theaters, and then your movie can't be available for home video until 9 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever, following its theatrical thing. And that might be a good way to make everybody happy, but I don't know that Netflix would go for something
Amazon
like that.
Studios is doing it. Amazon's already doing it. I mean, and they're following the rules, and they get Oscar-nominated films out there, and there's no problem. Netflix, I mean, the funny thing about Netflix is they just don't want to play with anyone. They just want to define the way
why should
forward.
They? Why should they?
They
really?
shouldn't.
I mean,
they shouldn't. But then, if they want to create their own thing, then why doesn't Netflix has its own Netflix awards and award their own stuff the way and have viewers vote? I don't know.
But I think one of the things you really point out that's really valid here, Robert, is times are changing. The mediums are changing, and so one way or the other, the rules need to change with them. And just find a good middle ground that works kind of for everybody and maybe makes everybody happy. And if you can't, then move in different directions. But something's got to change. Something's got to change.